Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. My name is Mateusz Fałkowski. I am deputy head of the Pilecki-Institut in Berlin and one of the conveners of this conference. It's a great pleasure to see you all here. The conference, Russia's War of Aggression Against Ukraine, is organized by the Polish Pilecki-Institut together with the German Center for Liberale Moderne, Liberal Modernity. But both organizations, actually speaking, also work very closely with Ukrainian friends and organizations. Without justice, there is no lasting peace. This is one of the possible thoughts that can serve as a reference points for the discussion today. We are an institution rooted in history, dealing with the history of Poland and the region in the 20th century, but this reflection on the role of witnesses, on the legal and historical vocabulary of the 20th century, on resistance to violence, and more broadly on modernity, had also led us to launch programs related to current challenges. A year ago, exactly in this room, where there is now an exhibition on Solidarity movement, we presented a temporary exhibition on Raphael Lemkin and the concept of genocide. It was already before the war it was prepared, but during the war it was presented to the public. At that time, the keynote lecture at the opening of the exhibition was given by Professor Annette Weinke from the University of Jena, who is also participating in this conference. The current exhibition on the Solidarity movement here tells the story not only of the great social movement in Poland of the 80s, but also of the world's solidarity with Solidarność movement. And this is also the program. We need solidarity just now with Ukraine. Downstairs, at the basement, where we are rebuilding currently our permanent exhibition on Witold Pilecki and the transformations of Auschwitz, we are now showing for the next 3 days the multimedia installation Shard of Unjudged Crimes based on Ukrainian testimonies of war collected within the initiative called the Lemkin Center. You are cordially invited to go downstairs during one of the breaks and see this installation. Before I ask Magdalena, Gawin, and Ralf Fücks to take the floor, I would just like to make a quick introduction. Dominika and John, stand up. John Cornell and Dominika Łuczkiewicz were instrumental in preparation of the program of the conference. There were more people involved, but they were crucial. And I would like also to mention Adam and Witek. Adam and Witek. So these two colleagues are really helpful at all organizational matters. And please feel free to communicate with them if you have any request or you have any organizational question or related to the logistic of your stay in Berlin. I would now like to introduce Magdalena, Gawin, and Ralf Fücks. Both are public intellectuals in the very sense of this word. So they combine work in the field of ideas with some institutional work. They are institution builders, both. Magdalena Gawin is historian, professor at the Institute of History of the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw, director, but also initiator of the Pilecki-Institut at the Lemkin Center, and was also previously Deputy Minister of Culture of Poland. So she is behind the idea of the Lemkin Center. Among other things, she has written a monography on the emancipation movement of Polish women at the turn of the 20th century. Ralf Fücks is the founder and director of the Center for Liberal Modernity, currently one of the German most important and interesting think tanks in Berlin. He was previously president of the Böll Foundation, Heinrich Böll Stiftung, so this is the political foundation related to the Green Party, associated with the Green Party. And as I already said, they both combine this work in the field of ideas with the strong focus on on that it's not enough to deliberate, we also have to act, and we also have to build institutions. Magda, please, the floor is yours.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. My name is Magdalena Gawin. I am director of Pilecki-Institut and a professor of history. It is true that my habilitation was about emancipation of women, but also I wrote PhD about eugenics, and I introduced the notion of eugenics into Polish historiography. So I deal generally with racial theory, racism, eugenics, 20th century history. First of all, I welcome all guests, historians, sociologists, political commentators, journalists, and experts on international law from Ukraine, from United States of America, Great Britain, Germany, and Poland, at the conference entitled Russia's War of Aggression Against Ukraine, Challenges of Documenting and Prosecuting War Crimes. I would like to welcome our partner, Zentrum Liberale Moderne, with its chief, Ralf Fücks. We expect also Anton Korynewicz, Foreign Ministry Special Envoy, who joined to us through internet soon. And please let me say a few words about Pilecki-Institut and the Lemkin Center and the idea behind the conference. The Pilecki-Institut was established a few years ago with the aim of renewing reflection of the notion of totalitarian regimes, their role in 20th century, and their aftermath. We digitizing archives from all over the world concerning the 20th century fates of Poland and East Central Europe in order to create a space in Warsaw where scholars from entire world could come to conduct their research. Without disregarding sources produced by state administration, the police, and diplomatic services, we attach particular importance to the role of witness. For this reason, we collect both wartime and post-wartime testimonies and accounts relating to two occupations, the German and the Soviet. We were the first. It's very hard to imagine after the 30 years of fall of communism, but we were the first to sort and categorize the testimonies of Polish citizens from the Soviet occupations that were made during the Second World War before the military division of the Anders Army. We estimated that we have around 100,000 of testimony from German occupation and about 100,000 from Soviets. And some of the testimonies from the collection that we call Chronicle of Terror were used in the main post-war trials of Nazi criminals in Poland, trials in Poland and in Germany. But not a single prosecutor or judge, however, had anything to do with the testimonies relating to Soviet occupation. Russia never had its Nuremberg, and this is the heart of the matter. The wars of aggression waged by Russia are not characterized by victories, for it also suffered defeats, for instance, from Poland in 1920. But the wars of aggression waged by Russia are characterized by the criminality of methods and the subsequent impunity. Subsequent impunity. And let me give two examples of manipulation, of history, of interpretation, which have very important impact of our present time. Cut and lie. Cut and lie is one of the most widespread lies in the modern history of Europe. In the spring of 1940, the Soviets murdered more than 20,000 Polish citizens, prisoners of war, including 10,000 officers. What does it mean, 10,000 officers? It means that the Soviets murdered 10,000 people with a higher education. Engineers, architects, writers, journalists, teachers, etc. When the crime was discovered, Soviets attributed the crime to Germany. And except for a short period of Yeltsin rule, they have never recognized their responsibility. The second example. In the 1950s, Rafał Lemkin put forward a thesis that the Holodomor in Ukraine bears all the hallmarks of genocide. For a long decades, Lemkin's opinion was questioned or ignored in the West as too controversial or suggesting dangerous parallel between the Soviet communism and the Nazism, or revisionist. These attitudes prevailed for a long time also in Germany, which has only recently recognized the Holodomor as a genocide. Thus, the contemporary Russian aggression is changing not only our present, but also our assessment of the past. Ladies and gentlemen, in this age of advanced technology, hiding a crime is very difficult, almost impossible. Photographs and recordings from video cameras and cell phones showing the dead bodies and the mass graves, the symbols of which are Bucha, Irpin, Mariupol, have circulated the world. And why we set up Lemkin Center if everybody are able to see the level of crimes committed by Russians in Ukraine? Because we want to protect memory. Because most of the testimonies which was put before the prosecutors will be closed and classified. So, collections of the Lemkin Center comprise thousands of Ukrainian testimonies in the form of questionnaires, interviews, recorded on a site in Ukraine, and photographs. After proper selection, they can be used in trials as they come from eyewitness. But historians and journalists will have access to them much, much earlier than to classified depositions. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, the links in the chain of Russian crimes and impunity must be broken. Aggressive war has allies. Passivity, egoism, self-esteem, and hypocrisy. Let's make an aggressive Russian war alone. The prosecution of the crimes is essential prerequisite for lasting peace in Europe and the prevention of future crimes. So I would like to wish all participants compelling papers and interesting discussions. Thank you very much.
And now Ralf Fücks.
Dear Magdalena, dear Mateusz, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, when we, the Center for Liberal Modernity, have been asked if we would be ready to serve as a partner for this conference, it was not a complicated decision to say yes. First, because we very much appreciate the work of the Berlin branch of the Pilecki-Institut, and even more since February 24, 2022. Second, because we were impressed by the draft program and the list of invited speakers, and today we are proud to co-host so many renowned scholars and public intellectuals in Berlin. Third, because in these days there's hardly a more important topic to think about than Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Its historic context, legal dimension, and its impact on the future of Europe. And this war is not just an episode which will pass. It is deeply changing not only the European landscape, but it will have a long-lasting impact on the global order. And last not least, we hope that this conference will provide an opportunity for an exchange between scholars and intellectuals with different backgrounds, and especially from Poland and Germany. It's not a secret that Polish-German relations are under stress because of a bunch of reasons. And it's all but clear if this war will finally strengthen European unity or deepen the rift within the European Union. We therefore even more welcome this platform for dialogue about a war that one way or another will determine our common future. Russia's war of aggression is not only a neo-colonial attempt to force Ukraine back into the Russian world and to destroy her political and cultural autonomy. At the same time, it's a massive attack against the European security order, against international law, and against all liberal aspirations in Central Eastern Europe. It's nothing less than a counter-revolutionary attempt to revise the political achievements of 1989 and 1990. If Russia's genocidal warfare goes unpunished, international law will be in ruins. And if Putin succeeds with his attack against Ukraine, this war may turn out as an interlude to a next, even bigger war between Russia and the West. Our political, military, and financial support for Ukraine in its struggle for existence is therefore not just a matter of solidarity. It is about Europe's very own interest, about our security, and about the defense of a value-based international order. Finally, because this conference is taking place in the heart of Berlin, allow me some remarks on Germany's attitudes towards this war. I'm quite aware of the widespread irritations about the vague language of our Chancellor regarding the endgame of the war and Germany's reluctant delivery of heavy weapons. But compared to our Eastern policy in the previous era, Germany has moved dramatically over the last year. From our special relationship with Russia and no delivery of weapons to Ukraine at all, to one of the biggest suppliers of military equipment for the Ukrainian army, including the last decision on Leopard battle tanks. From a domestic perspective, this is a dramatic shift that should be acknowledged. But compared to the massivity of Russia's war of destruction and Ukraine's desperate struggle to survive, Germany's policy still seems to follow the pattern of too little, too late. This may be due in part to considerations for reservations among the German population. Majorities for the delivery of tanks and other weapon systems to Ukraine are relatively close. But it seems to me that the core of the problem is that neither the German government nor the West as a whole has yet made a clear decision to provide Ukraine with everything it needs to win this war. The reasons for this hesitation are manifold: fear of escalation, doubt about the feasibility of a military victory over Russia, and the hope that a diplomatic arrangement with the Kremlin could ultimately be found. This hesitant approach also characterizes the official stance taken so far on the establishment of a special tribunal to hold Russia's political and military leadership accountable for the ongoing war crimes in Ukraine. This would be a definitive break with the Putin regime, and in effect, it would slam the door on a negotiated settlement. But again, it seems that Germany is moving slowly, but ultimately in the right direction. At least I hope so. I'm confident that this conference will provide us with illuminating insights on all these questions. Finally, I would like to thank again the Pilecki-Institut for the good cooperation, and I'm looking forward for an exciting conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ralf. Thank you, Magda. Dear colleagues, every political behavior and any attempt on war is embedded in the past. And we can have such a perspective on the Russia's war of aggression as some form of embeddedness in the Soviet past. I would like to invite you to the keynote lecture by Professor Mark Kramer from Harvard. Mark Kramer is a wonderful scholar of the Cold War, but not only. Is director of the Cold War Studies at Harvard University, director of Harvard's Sakharov Program on Human Rights, author of many books and journal articles, and with such a wonderful broad view on the region and on the Cold War past, but also on the present. Mark will give a lecture with the title, but maybe Mark, is up to you, to say this, what is the title of your lecture? So.
Very good. Thank you very much, Mateusz. Let me also add that I want to join what Mateusz said about thanking Dominika and John and also Adam and Witold. So all of you were very helpful in preparing for this. So I am going to speak from the PowerPoint. I deliberately, when I speak to audiences where most of the members are not native speakers of English, I always prepare quite a bit of text, just so in case I refer to a particular word or a name or something that's not clear. So, but I'll basically be sticking fairly closely to the slides that I present. I retailored my lecture some as I was looking over the program a couple of weeks ago. I realized that I was initially going to talk more about the way history has been manipulated by Putin's administration and the lead up to the war. And I will be, I will be referring to that. But but I also wanted to say, though, a good deal about non-compliance with international humanitarian law and the origins of that in Soviet policy and how it has continued over into the Russian Federation. And so that's what I will be focusing on, because I think it will provide a basis for discussing the current war and the difficulties, challenges of holding Russian leaders accountable. Ralf mentioned a very key phrase, war of aggression, which ultimately at Nuremberg was seen as the fundamental charge, because the starting of a war opens the way for the atrocities and crimes that are committed, as they were during the Second World War. And of course, they were committed not only by the Germans. The Germans were the ones who were being judged, but there were rampant crimes and atrocities as well committed by Soviet forces, starting not in 1941 as the date that's chosen in Russia nowadays to refer to the start of the war. It began in September 1939. I'll be, if I could move to the next slide, please. Or do I have the ability to control that? I guess I do here, right? So modern international humanitarian law, or IHL as it's often referred to, it's a set of norms and commitments governing the conduct of armed conflict. It doesn't make war humane. War is inherently barbaric, but it reduces the capacity of war to cause massive damage to civilian populations, as well as the gross abuse of prisoners of war. That dates, the effort to reduce the barbarity of war dates back to the 19th century, the seminal agreements, the Geneva Conventions that were concluded in the 19th century. But then there were seminal agreements, the 4 Geneva Conventions in particular, that were concluded just after the Second World War. It wasn't just the Geneva Conventions, also the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. All of these came together in the late 1940s in direct response to the way the Second World War had been conducted. And that involved massive crimes committed not only by the Germans and the Japanese, but also by the Soviet Red Army. So the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949 brought together and strengthened the principles that were laid out in earlier Geneva Conventions, starting in the 19th century and then the early 20th century. They added the important convention on the protection of civilian populations, because civilian populations were not covered by the earlier Geneva Conventions. So the Soviet Union signed the 4 Geneva Conventions, although it did attach reservations regarding Conventions 3 and 4. I won't spell out what those reservations were. They weren't of enormous significance. But in December 1949, so just after the conclusion of those conventions, and then ratified them in April 1954, a year after Stalin's death. So from 1974 to 77, in that period in the mid-1970s, Soviet officials played an active role in the Geneva Conference on the reaffirmation and development of international humanitarian law applicable in armed conflicts. This was an effort to make to update the Geneva Conventions, to have them apply to internal conflicts, to civil wars, for example, which in the process of decolonization had become extremely common in the world. And the Geneva Conventions, as they were originally formulated, applied only to interstate wars. And so this was an effort to have them apply to internal wars as well. There were 2 protocols. Whoops. Wait a second, I'm gone. Sorry. So from here, there were these 2 additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions, and in particular, the 2nd additional protocol is relevant to the war in Chechnya. I'll come back to that in a minute. That is the current Russian Federation. So the 2 protocols, one dealing with international armed conflicts, the second one, which is the one applying to internal wars, is the non-international armed conflicts or civil wars. And it was supposed to broaden the coverage of the original Geneva Conventions. So from the Soviet Union's perspective, which was providing arms to guerrilla movements, especially far-left guerrilla movements in the Third World, this was a welcome step in giving a privileged status to those anti-Western guerrilla movements. It allowed them to come under the coverage of the Geneva Conventions. So the Soviet government signed the 2 additional protocols in December 1977, but didn't end up ratifying them until September 1989, which was shortly after Soviet troops completed their withdrawal from Afghanistan. For reasons that I won't get into now, but those 2 events were quite closely connected. The Conventions 1 and 2, that is of the 4 original Geneva Conventions, were incorporated into the legal guidelines for Soviet military commanders and servicemen in February 1958. The then Soviet Defense Minister, Rodion Malinovsky, issued Directive Number 20, titled Instructions for the Adoption within the Armed Forces of the USSR of the Geneva Conventions and so forth. So it was to take those international legal documents and incorporate them into Soviet domestic documents, documents governing Soviet military procedures. The Soviet legislature followed up in December 1958 by including provisions, Articles 32 and 33, relating to Conventions 1 and 2 in the amended law on criminal responsibility for crimes committed against the state. And then until February 1990, however, Conventions 3 and 4, which pertain to the treatment of prisoners of war and the protection of civilian populations, as well as the 2 additional protocols, the protocols negotiated in the 1970s. Those were left out of the Soviet Defense Ministry's legal guidelines until February of 1990. I'll get to that in a minute. In January 1990, 33 years ago, the Soviet military and internal security forces undertook a large-scale incursion into Soviet Azerbaijan and quickly crushed the Azerbaijani Popular Front. There was an anti-communist Azerbaijani and separatist Azerbaijani Popular Front that had taken root. So a few weeks later, with that fighting in Azerbaijan over, Soviet Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov signed Directive Number 75 on the proclamation of the Geneva Conventions regarding the protection of victims of war. So it wasn't until very late in the Soviet period that that was done. The issuance of that directive marked the first time that legal guidelines for the Soviet armed forces did take account, at least nominal account, of international humanitarian law, what in Russian is called Narodное гуманитарное право, MGP as the acronym is in Russian, just as in English, IHL. So Yazov's signature of that directive was preceded by a very heated debate within the Soviet High Command and Soviet Defense Council. The records, I was able to obtain records of that debate about 5 years ago. They were released to me, even though I found out later that they were not supposed to be. But they are, I posted them on the internet to make sure that everyone would have access to them. There were influential generals such as Vladislav Achalov, who was the commander of Soviet airborne forces, were often engaged in the suppression of internal violence in the Soviet Union. Also, Valentin Varenikov, one of the commanders of the invasion of Afghanistan, who spoke strongly against the directive. They did not want the issuance of that directive, taking account of the protocols. Yazov himself, Defense Minister Yazov, was initially skeptical of the wisdom of doing this. He cited the, quote, unfounded criticism and malicious hostility, unquote, that supposedly were already being directed against the armed forces for their role in cracking down on political and nationalist unrest in the Caucasus and elsewhere. So some of the proponents of the directive cited the atrocities perpetrated by Afghan guerrillas against Soviet POWs during the 1979-1989 war. That is true. The Afghan guerrillas often treated Soviet prisoners very brutally. So it's not an unfounded reason in citing. That they emphasize this, though, as a reason for incorporating Convention 3 and the additional protocols into Soviet directives. Other supporters argue that the directive would give a boost to the so-called new political thinking during the Gorbachev period. And so there were arguments used on both sides, but ultimately Defense Minister Yazov did issue the directive. So Yazov acquiesced in that decision, and again, under considerable pressure from Gorbachev, who had just assumed the new post of Soviet president. He became the first Soviet president in March 1990 when that new office was created. He was not elected to the office. Some of his colleagues urged him to be elected, but he decided he would be appointed to it instead. So as a result, the directive was promulgated. Even though the 4 Geneva Conventions and 2 additional protocols were not formally incorporated into Soviet military guidance until 1990, this didn't mean that Soviet troops invariably acted with unrestrained brutality in earlier years. On 5 occasions after 1949, Soviet soldiers openly took part in military operations abroad. These were in East Germany in June 1953, in Hungary in October, November 1956, in Czechoslovakia in August 1968, at numerous disputed sites along the border with China from March to September 1969, and in Afghanistan, of course, from December 1979 to February 1989, the 9-year war. Soviet military pilots also surreptitiously engaged in aerial combat during the Korean War and Vietnam War and conflicts in the Middle East, the Arab-Israeli wars, as well as especially the War of Attrition in 1970. But their participation in participation in those instances was not openly acknowledged. So the 5 openly acknowledged uses of force occurred here, and I don't have time to go through all of them, although I have written about all of them, so I can refer if anyone's interested. Written about them, not only about how they occurred, but also the relevance of international humanitarian law to the way Soviet troops performed. But in these 5 cases, the record of compliance with the Geneva Conventions was mixed. And I mention that mostly because it wasn't uniformly negative. It was pretty negative, but it wasn't uniformly. Certainly in the first instance of use, it was much more in compliance, surprisingly. In June 1953, the first instance, the Soviet Union had not yet ratified the Geneva Conventions. That didn't occur until April 1954, and was only 8 years away from the end of a devastating war in which Soviet and German troops had clashed with unremitting ferocity. The Soviet occupation of Eastern Germany from 1945 on had been extraordinarily harsh. So you would have expected in June 1953 that Soviet troops in confronting an uprising in East Germany, it wasn't just in East Berlin, it was all through East Germany, about 600,000 people taking part, as recent research has shown. So nonetheless, when the 17 Soviet tank and mechanized divisions, who were supplemented by artillery, communications, and logistic regiments and battalions, were deployed on the 17th of June 1953 to quell that uprising, they behaved with surprising restraint, relying mainly on intimidation rather than the direct use of force. The limited fighting that did take place was almost all over within a day. A top secret U.S. intelligence report at the time noted that, quote, the Soviet troops in putting down the rebellion demonstrated a remarkable discipline, restraint, and cool-headedness, which came as a surprise to all, foremost to the East Germans, unquote. Whether that restraint would have continued if large-scale violent resistance had erupted and had been sustained for many weeks in numerous East German cities is a different matter. I tend to doubt it, but certainly given that the uprising was suppressed relatively quickly, even though it was very wide scale, Soviet troops were not engaged in the kind of brutality one might have expected. By contrast, the Soviet Union's intervention in Hungary did reflect grave problems. The initial intervention in Hungary on the 23rd of October 1956 involved only a limited number of Soviet troops, but the introduction of even that small contingent of Soviet forces into Budapest merely fueled the rebellion. Instead of dampening it down, it fueled it and converted it from a mass protest against the Stalinist regime in Hungary, the Rákosi regime, which had been succeeded by Erno Gero, that it turned it from an anti-Stalinist protest into an anti-Soviet as well as anti-Stalinist uprising aimed at breaking Hungary away from the USSR. So that's what the intervention of Soviet troops achieved. On the 27th of October, the Hungarian Red Cross, whose headquarters and vehicles had been largely destroyed by Soviet gunfire and bombardment, urged the International Committee of the Red Cross, which has responsibility for overseeing implementation of the Geneva Conventions. It has had all along. It was given that responsibility. So the Hungarian Red Cross urged the ICRC to undertake an emergency relief operation and, quote, to ensure that the provisions of the Fourth Geneva Convention for the protection of the civilian population are strictly respected, unquote. The ICRC made a preliminary delivery of relief supplies via the Hungarian Red Cross on the 29th of October, but Soviet commanders prevented the ICRC from bringing in additional supplies by air 2 days later. The ICRC managed to deliver food and other materials by ground on the 1st of November, but from then until the 11th of November, the Soviet Union blocked any further ICRC deliveries by either air or ground. Starting on the 31st of October, the ICRC repeatedly broadcast an appeal on shortwave radio exhorting, quote, all concerned, unquote, to abide by several fundamental principles contained in the Geneva Conventions, unquote. On the 4th of November, which was the day that the much larger Soviet invasion of Hungary began, at the urging of the Hungarian Red Cross, the ICRC issued a further appeal calling on all, quote, commanders and combatants in Hungary, which they really had in mind, Soviet commanders, to allow the ICRC to evacuate and care for all the wounded, quote, in accordance with the provision of Article 5 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, unquote. Soviet commanders brushed aside that plea as they continued with a much larger invasion of Hungary, using more than 200,000 Soviet soldiers as compared to 30,000 or so in the initial intervention. The crackdown on the Hungarian rebels was brutal and caused great destruction and bloodshed among civilians. By the time the fighting diminished on the 9th of November, more than 2,500 Hungarian civilians were dead and more than 19,000 were gravely wounded. So it was a very bloody invasion, much, it was a real contrast to 3 years earlier in East Germany. Afterward, the Soviet Union did permit the ICRC to resume relief operations in Hungary, which lasted from the 11th of November 1956 until June 1957, despite occasional disruptions and harassment. Nonetheless, overall, the invasion of Hungary was notable mostly for the Soviet Union's failure to comply with key provisions of the Geneva Conventions, and of course there was no accountability afterward. I should add, the United Nations issued a special report on the problem of Hungary later on, and it did contain extensive discussion about the Soviet Union's breaches of the Geneva Conventions, but it was just a report. There was no effort to establish any kind of tribunal. So whatever, phone. In any case, let me say, subsequent investigations by international legal organizations and by a UN Special Committee on the crisis concluded that Soviet forces in Hungary had been culpable of, quote, flagrant violations of the Geneva Conventions, including shooting indiscriminately at civilians and unarmed fighters who were trying to surrender, as well as, quote, many cases of shooting at ambulances, Red Cross vehicles, and the doctors and nurses in those vehicles. You can see distinct parallels with the current war. So Soviet officials dismissed those accusations out of hand and refused to respond on a point-by-point basis when the UN General Assembly convened a special emergency session on the 4th and 10th of, from the 4th to the 10th of November 1956 to discuss the situation in Hungary. Under Soviet pressure, the matter was eventually removed from the UN's agenda altogether. And again, I bring all of this up to say that if you think about the current war that the Russian Federation is engaged in, then many of these same things not only have happened, but I can predict they will happen again. Just given the position of the Russian Federation in the UN Security Council, it was allowed to inherit the Soviet permanent seat on the UN Security Council, a step I opposed back in 1991. I wrote an op-ed article recommending that the permanent seat be rotated among the former Soviet republics, but that's not the way. There was never any real proposal to do that when Western governments, particularly the US government, were drafting the international recognition of the newly independent Russian Federation and the other 14 former Soviet republics. It was not, none of that was done. The Russian Federation was allowed to inherit the nuclear arsenal and to be given the permanent seat on the UN Security Council without any sharing with other republics. So the 9 years of, and again, because I have limited time, so I'm not going to refer to the invasion of Czechoslovakia, which had very little violence in it. It was a massive operation, several 100,000 Soviet troops involved, but there was no violent resistance. So so let me then end on discussing the Soviet period and then to move to the Russian Federation, is to say the 9 years of warfare that followed the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979 were marked by unrestrained violence and destruction. If you want to understand why Afghanistan is the mess that it is today, a great deal of it goes back to this war, much more so than anything that happened over the last 30 years, although that too caused a great deal of problems in Afghanistan. But the 9 years of warfare during the late Soviet period in the 1980s were the key source of the problem. Immense suffering was inflicted on Afghan civilians. The guerrillas resisting the Soviet occupation routinely committed atrocities during the war, but Soviet forces were responsible for the overwhelming share of the bloodshed and misery endured by the civilian population. Just given the scale of the war that Soviet troops waged, that's not surprising that they accounted for the overwhelming share of atrocities committed during the war. Western governments, NGOs, UN special envoys, and international legal experts repeatedly accused the Soviet Union of gross violations of the Geneva Conventions and international human rights agreements. I can point to, there are stacks of these that I have in my files in my Harvard office. But Soviet leaders dismissed those allegations and blocked efforts by NGOs, UN commissions, and other international bodies to conduct more in-depth investigations. Even during the Gorbachev period, in the latter half of the 1980s, the Soviet government did not formally respond to charges that Soviet troops in Afghanistan had been culpable of systematic violations of the Geneva Conventions. So let me turn then, having looked at some of the legacy of the Soviet period, starting out with an operation that one might have expected rampant brutality in East Germany in 1953, that in fact did not have that, in which it was emphasized, to looking at subsequent conflicts in which there were massive violations of the Geneva Conventions and other laws of war by Soviet troops. Sometimes the others in the opposing side as well committed such atrocities, but Soviet troops were in all of these the chief perpetrator of war crimes and atrocities. So let me turn then to the post-Soviet period to show how this record, very troubling record from the Soviet period, has been carried over. So the government of the Russian Federation inherited the Soviet Union's obligations under the Geneva Conventions and additional protocols. That was part of the agreement on having the Russian Federation seen as what was called the successor state to the Soviet Union, that it had to take on all of the obligations under Soviet treaties. And so that included the Geneva Conventions and additional protocols. The Russian government, subsequent to the breakup of the Soviet Union, formally accepted its obligations under these legal documents as well as many others. So the main guidelines on international humanitarian law compiled by the Russian Defense Ministry affirm that, quote, and I'm quoting these guidelines, the Russian Federation, as the legal successor to the Soviet Union, is a participant in nearly all protocols of international humanitarian law. That is actually a true statement. It is a participant. It's a question of what participation means. The Russian Defense Ministry's guidelines go on to say that, quote, the norms and principles of the law of armed conflicts are obligatory for all categories of service personnel to fulfill when undertaking combat operations and when carrying out peacekeeping missions. Consequently, every serviceman must know them. Bear that in mind, what I've just quoted there from the Russian Defense Ministry's guidelines, if you think about the way the current war is being conducted. But it's not just that, it's also the wars in Chechnya, which when I began looking at some of these issues, I was studying the wars in Chechnya. And I asked Russian troops whether, in fact, this was true, that they were required to learn the Geneva Conventions. And as I found, it simply is untrue. I'll get to that. Paragraph 4 of Article 15 of the Russian Constitution states, the universally recognized norms of international law and the international treaties and agreements of the Russian Federation shall be a component part of the country's legal system. If an international treaty or agreement of the Russian Federation fixes rules other than those envisaged by law, the rules of the international agreement shall be applied. That's an interesting concept in which international legal documents take precedence over, or international legal obligations that the Russian Federation has assumed are supposed to take precedence over domestic law. Because in the Putin era, that has been reversed, that anything that is in contradiction with, or at least at odds with, domestic law is simply disregarded. So in principle, that formulation establishes the Geneva Conventions and additional protocols, the 2 additional protocols, as Russian law. And I keep on mentioning the additional protocols because additional protocol 2 is directly relevant to the war in Chechnya, which the 4 original Geneva protocols were not. So by the time the Russian Constitution was adopted in December 1993, the Russian government had taken significant steps toward integrating the Geneva Conventions and additional protocols into the new post-Soviet order. In 1992, the ICRC was allowed and, in fact, encouraged to open a branch in Moscow, something that had never been permitted during the Soviet era. And as I think all of you know, the ICRC branch was closed under Putin. But certainly in 1993, it was quite strongly encouraged to open a branch. In the spring of 1993, the ICRC also adopted a regional office in the North Caucasus, which the war there hadn't started, but it was pretty clear that there was going to be trouble there. So they opened a branch in the North Caucasus. It is headquartered in Nalchik, the capital of Kabardino-Balkaria, which is to the west of Chechnya, which in subsequent years was responsible for, quote, that office was responsible for, quote, running a major humanitarian operation comprising both protection and assistance programs for the vulnerable populations affected by the conflict in Chechnya. At that time, Russian federal forces weren't involved in Chechnya, but in 1993. But this particular statement was drafted after that, during the war. And so it was also the ICRC office was supposed to promote international humanitarian law. Nonetheless, the legal steps adopted by the Russian government had no effect on Russia's conduct in either of the wars it fought in Chechnya after the breakup of the Soviet Union. The first war lasting from December 1994 to August 1996, and the second lasting from October 1999 to March 2009. Combat soldiers from the Russian Army and the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs who were sent to Chechnya were not, I was able to confirm all of this by looking at the training materials and other documents from the time, as well as interviewing Russian soldiers, that they were not given any training in the Geneva Conventions. They were regularly given assignments that contravened basic principles of the Geneva Conventions and other documents of international humanitarian law, and even Russian domestic law. So there was no effort at all made to comply with these. Now, that was justified on the basis that this in the case of the Second War, that it was described as a counter-terrorist operation, and a counter-terrorist operation arguably does not fall under the auspices of Additional Protocol 2. But of course, any reasonable person would see that what was going on in Chechnya was a civil war, which certainly would fall under Additional Protocol 2. But the excuse given to avoid compliance with Additional Protocol 2 was that it was a counter-terrorist operation. Many Russian commanding officers in Chechnya were aware of the Geneva Conventions, and some commanders understood the provisions very thoroughly. I spoke with some of them, but none of them felt under any obligation to comply with any of the conventions. There was clearly no pressure from up top to comply with these provisions, and there was no fear of any punishment for ordering troops to commit massive violations of the Geneva Conventions. Throughout the two wars, I'm referring to the Chechen wars, the atrocities were committed by both sides at the expense of civilians. Russian troops engaged in systematic abuses of non-combatants, including torture, rape, forced disappearances, mass roundups, the so-called zachistki, kidnapping, and summary executions. Far from seeking to rectify those abuses, commanding officers frequently condoned them or at least turned a blind eye. So again, you can see very distinct parallels here with the current war. There was no fear of being punished by committing such abuses. During the first Russian-Chechen War, the abuses committed by, and I should add, I was referring to the Second War there, but in this case, during the first Russian-Chechen War, the abuses committed by Russian forces were often ignored, but occasionally they did provoke a public outcry in Russia. This was in the 90s. Reports broadcast by the independent NTV station that were highly critical of Kremlin policy helped to focus public sentiment in Russia against the conflict. During the Second War, by contrast, Putin reimposed state control of television, including NTV, and ensured that all coverage was compatible with official aims. So that independent voice that was there in the 1990s was almost immediately targeted by Putin after he became Russian president at the end of 1999 and then was formally elected in March 2000. Another reason for the lack of any accountability in Russia for the failure to comply with the Geneva Conventions was Putin's success in undermining opposition parties and political competition in Russia. During the first Russian-Chechen war, the 1994 to 96 war, some of the strongest criticism of Russian atrocities came from opposition party leaders in the Russian parliament and from Yeltsin's rivals in the 1996 presidential election. They did openly criticize the war, and in fact helped to turn public opposition much more against the war during that first war. So it shows even in Russia, if you have the opportunity to voice opinions openly, to cover the war accurately, public opinion can, in fact, be turned around. What has been crucial during the Putin era is that he has eliminated those sources of independent thinking, and instead he has controlled how Russians see all of the war. During the Second War, Putin brought the parliament under his control, used his control of the media, especially television, to eviscerate the two parties that embraced Western-style liberal democracy. He also marginalized all other political organizations that posed even the slightest challenge to his own power or challenged the conduct of the Chechen War. In the absence of genuine political debate about the role of international humanitarian law in the Second Russian-Chechen War, a grassroots movement to hold the authorities responsible for violations of the Geneva Conventions was a non-starter. There was no way it could happen in the Putin-era Russian Federation. Some Russian and international NGOs, such as Memorial, which has now been disbanded, Human Rights Watch, which was kicked out of Russia, Amnesty International, which was kicked out of Russia in the past few years, published many critical reports about the rampant torture, killing, and other abuses committed by both sides in Chechnya, but these reports were consistently ignored by the Russian government, which was almost wholly unaccountable for its conduct of the Second War in Chechnya. So as that war proceeded, and even as terrorist bombings were occurring in Russian cities, especially Moscow, I was there during one of those terrorist bombings. There was no debate about it. It was quite striking that something that affected people's lives directly, because there were hundreds of Russians killed in those terrorist bombings, that it didn't provoke any debate about the war. Much the same was true about Russia's war in Lebanon and Lebanon. It should be Syria, sorry. I'm not sure how that got changed to Lebanon. In any case, that must have been spell checker or something that somehow did a search and replace. It should be Syria. That Russian forces intervened starting in September 2015 in Syria to take the side of Assad, of the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria, and to shift that war into Assad's favor. And in fact, they were successful in doing so, because otherwise, it's certainly the Assad government was on the verge of losing control in Syria. Russian forces engaged in relentless bombardment of civilian targets in Syria. Just pretend Lebanon is Syria. It's supposed to be Syria. I still am not clear how that got replaced. But including hospitals, maternity wards, schools, kindergartens, playgrounds, and food stores. The same sorts of targets that have been destroyed in Ukraine, deliberately destroyed. It's not an accidental effect of collateral damage. It's deliberate destruction of civilian targets. Human rights NGOs in Syria and international human rights organizations extensively documented the atrocities perpetrated by Russian troops, but no one in the Russian military was ever held accountable. On the contrary, the Russian commanders who oversaw the mass killing of civilians in Syria were given medals and promoted. One of them, in fact, was put for a brief while in charge of the war in Ukraine, General Surovikin, who had earlier been involved in operations in Syria. So conclusions then of this, and where I'll end, would be the brutality of Russia's military operations during these various periods. And it's the same is true of the Soviet operations, especially in Afghanistan. The brutality, and even more during the Second World War, the brutality of Russia's military operations stemmed not so much from a lack of awareness of the norms of international humanitarian law as from a lack of willingness to comply with them, regardless of the country's supposed commitment to uphold them. So the Russian Federation does have all of those obligations that it has taken on, but it also has demonstrated that it has no willingness to comply with them. Policymakers in Moscow may have pledged their acceptance of humanitarian principles by signing and ratifying international treaties, but when faced with the exigencies of armed conflict, they simply ignored their commitments and gave the Russian army a free hand. And again, all of that has been repeated over the past year. There are parallels with all of these conflicts. For me, it wasn't surprising. In fact, I would have been shocked if it had been the other way around, just as I was about June 19, I mean, I wasn't alive in June 1953, but I would have been surprised at that time if I had been alive. It would have been shocking to me if Russian troops in Ukraine had behaved less brutally. And obviously, tragically, I haven't been surprised. Russian military commanders, for their part, were in many instances aware, and still are during the current war, were aware of the basic norms of international humanitarian law, but they had no desire or incentive to abide by them. It's not how their careers would be advanced if they were to comply with international humanitarian law. The Russian case underscores what can happen when officials at all levels of political and military power care nothing about international humanitarian law, and when other factors that might induce compliance, like a supranational enforcement body, the type of thing that has never really happened, except after the fact, when there are international tribunals set up in a few instances, that's also absent here. There is no supranational enforcement body. In the few instances in which such, after the fact, there have been international tribunals set up with regard to, say, former Yugoslavia, with regard to Rwanda, with regard to the Extraordinary Chamber in the Court of Cambodia, which dealt with an internal matter, the atrocities committed by the Khmer Rouge, that in all of those instances it came only after the fact, and those were relatively weak countries, that is, small countries that did not have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council and other such means of leverage. So that, it's really this question about there is no career incentive to comply with international humanitarian law. There is no other incentive, no external constraint that would bring about compliance with international law. So as we proceed with the conference and all of these issues come up, this is what I would fundamentally point to, is if you want to avoid such atrocious circumstances in the future, it is going to require a wholesale change of the way the practices and incentives in Russia are structured, and that is a very tall order. So thank you.
So, many thanks, Mark. So you left me a little pessimistic about the impact of formal institutions like law or formal conventions on human behavior. But please take notes and think about your concise questions or comments. But the first comment will be given by Dr. Iryna Solonenko. Iryna is the director of the Ukrainian program at the Center for Liberal Modernity. And she has experience in international relations. She was a fellow at the German Association for Foreign Policy. She was at Open Society Foundation. She was at Viadrina and other institutions. So Iryna, please comment on the lecture of Mark.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be here and also to be a co-organizer in some sense of this event. Thank you very much, Mark Kramer, for your excellent presentation. It's indeed very striking how many similarities in terms of conduct of the war we observe between past events and today, and also non-compliance with international law, which also Russia demonstrates systematically today. I would like probably add a few points speaking from Ukrainian perspective. And the first point I would like to make is that the Russian crimes we're observing today are instruments of a bigger picture, of a bigger story, of a story which for Ukraine has been lasting for some hundreds of years. And this is a story of Russian imperialism, which denied Ukraine's actorness, denied Ukraine's separate language, identity, and of course its right to have a sovereign state. And this was the case in Russian Empire and also in the Soviet Union. Magdalena already mentioned Holodomor. There was also intended extermination of intelligentsia, Ukrainian intelligentsia, known as executive renaissance. Actually, the term also which was brought up by a Polish intellectual, Jerzy Gedroic. And this was a case when, according to some accounts, 30,000 of Ukrainian intellectuals, writers, poets, actors of culture were killed, prosecuted, actually exterminated. Also we know Gulag and Solovki, and interestingly, the Ukrainian prisoners constituted the biggest group. Of course, there were representatives of other Soviet republics, but Ukrainian prisoners constituted the biggest group of prisoners in this Gulag and Solovki in these camps. And also, I wanted to remind, because we were talking a lot about it, at least in Ukraine, between 1970 and 1920, Ukraine had a statehood, and actually Ukrainian embassy was located very close to where we are now, where the Swiss embassy is now. And Ukraine was claiming its right for statehood during the Paris Peace Conference during these years, and Russia's propaganda, Russia's disinformation played a key role in the fact that Ukraine did not succeed, like some countries who also were parts of empires which collapsed during this time. My point here is that Russia has subsequently aimed at exterminating Ukraine as such, Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian language, and what we observe now is also a clear genocidal intent. We had a conference in Berlin some months ago where Timothy Snyder actually even presented 6 arguments why there was a genocidal intent in the starting this war by Russia today. And we also know speeches and articles by Putin and Medvedev who clearly state that Ukraine has no right for sovereignty for its own state. So it's important to remember that these crimes are a part of a bigger story of an intent to exterminate Ukraine as such. And second, it was already mentioned today, what we're observing today is a consequence of the fact that Russia never accepted responsibility for these crimes. It was not accountable with respect to international law, and it's very surprising that the whole international infrastructure, international institutions humankind created after the Second World War to promote international law were not able to do anything to bring Russia to accountability or Soviet Union to accountability. This is the problem we should, I think, somehow solve now in the course or after this war against Ukraine. And so the fact that Russia never was brought to responsibility and never recognized its responsibility like Germany did, for instance, leads to new crimes, to new aggression. And the one we observe now is exactly the result of that inability to accept responsibility and an inability of international law to punish. And third, maybe I would narrow down, focus a bit we are going to talk mostly during this conference about crimes committed since February 2022. But we should remember that Russian aggression started in March 2014. And what we have now is continuation of that aggression. Is also a result of the fact that many Western actors accepted Russian narrative of the situation. Basically, Russia claimed it's not us, these are some separatists. We are not a party to conflict or to this war. And so Germany and France, for instance, by signing Minsk agreement, having created Normandy format and signing Minsk protocols, have actually have played by the rules which Russia has dictated. And from this perspective, it's very important. Just recently, on the 25th of January, the European Court of Human Rights has ruled, and I will cite, among other things, the court found that the areas in eastern Ukraine in separatist hands were from 11th of May 2014 and up to at least 26th of January 2022 under the jurisdiction of Russian Federation. And also the court found that Crimea was also in control of Russia since March 2014, and therefore court has jurisdiction to prosecute or to rule against Russia for violation of human rights in these territories. I think it's a very important signal, which means how wrong we were all this time until the full-scale invasion by playing with Russia or playing with the rules or Russia has dictated. So my concluding point would be based on these observations that first, the war, how much cruel and terrible it is. The occupational regimes are also terrible. I haven't gone into details, but there were a number of cases already brought to the attention of the European Court of Human Rights, and there are organizations who have documented crimes which Russia has committed since 2014. And because there are a lot of voices in Germany that Ukraine should give up its territories, maybe stop this conflict diplomatically. So my point would be it's impossible because occupational regimes also historically are cruel, are inhuman. So we have no right to tolerate this. And secondly, yes, we have to work on strengthening the capacity of the international institutions to implement and to promote international law. And I wanted actually to ask Mark Kramer, Ukraine is now advocating for expelling Russia from the United Nations, and basically saying that Russia just replaced the names, the table plate from Soviet Union to Russia. It never applied for membership in the United Nations, like, for instance, Czechia and Slovakia did after dissemination of Czech Republic, or countries who belong to former Yugoslavia did. Russia never applied for membership in the UN, so to what extent it's legal for Russia to be there and undermine from within the whole architecture which is supposed to protect international law. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Iryna. So please come in here. Please. Mark, would you like to react to this comment?
Sure. Let me just pick up on a couple of points. With regard to the ECHR, the European Court on Human Rights, it actually played quite an important role with regard to Chechnya. By far the largest number of cases brought before the ECHR over the last 20 years have been related to Chechnya. And there have been, even though it has been very difficult to prosecute these, there have been some successful prosecutions, and the Russian government, for the most part, did comply with paying reparations to people who had been gravely injured during wars or had been, in other ways been abused. For example, with there was a Russian colonel, Yuri Budanov, who had raped and murdered a Chechen woman, Kungaeva, and as a result, he actually was imprisoned in Russia, although then he was let out and he died not long after, so he didn't suffer as much punishment as he should. But there was some accountability there on a very limited basis, but it was brought about by the ECHR. As of the 1st of September of this year, Russia will withdraw all commitment to the ECHR and will no longer feel itself bound by the ECHR. So that is, again, a direct consequence of the current war, that even that very tenuous effort to impose some restraint on Russian behavior will be gone as of the 1st of September. With regard to the question that you raised, would just remind me quickly, sorry. Oh, right. With regard to Russia, Russia is legally a member of the UN. That is, as part of its obligations as the successor state to the Soviet Union, which was true of other former Soviet republics, that they didn't automatically, but basically by signing requisite documents, they did become members of the United Nations. So it wasn't quite the case that countries emerged from decolonization in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, that they had to go through a process of, in some cases, a fairly lengthy process of application. In this case, it was quite prompt for the admission of Soviet republics, including the Russian Federation, into the UN. The more controversial matter, though, is Russia's holding of the permanent seat on the UN Security Council, which is just a legacy of the way the UN was set up. In 1945, that it was determined that the 5 countries that claimed to be the victors in the Second World War, and that included some that played very, very little role. Nationalist China at that point held the seat, and France, which had played very little role in the war. Britain played a much greater role, and then certainly the United States and the Soviet Union. So they were victors in the war, but as a result, that structure was created to privilege them, to give them an immense privilege of having a veto over any measures that came before the Security Council. When the Soviet Union was ending in 1991, there were proposals put forth. I don't remember whether Ukraine brought these up, but certainly, oddly enough, in Belarus, there was one international legal expert, and then also in Georgia and in the Soviet Republic of Georgia, and in one or two other cases, there were efforts to bring up the question about rotating the permanent seat on the UN Security Council. So for 6 months, one would be given the permanent seat, and then 6 months later, another would be given it. So that would mean that the Russian Federation, for example, would have the UN Security Council seat, because probably the Baltic states wouldn't have been part of such an arrangement, but the 12 other former republics of the Soviet Union would have. So Ukraine would have just as much control of the permanent seat on the UN Security Council as the Russian Federation would. That proposal, which I did actually in an op-ed article in the Washington Post, and I think it was December of 1991, although it might have been November, did put forth, it got no traction at all, that U.S. officials, Secretary of State James Baker at that time, and also President George H.W. Bush, basically were eager just to get things done and settle things before the Soviet Union broke apart. So they agreed to have the Russian Federation become the legal successor state to the Soviet Union, including inheriting the permanent seat on the UN Security Council, and also being allowed to keep sole charge of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. So there were nuclear weapons in three other former Soviet republics, strategic nuclear weapons, I should say. There were tactical nuclear weapons in about 11 or 12. But those were less of a problem because those were collected quite quickly. But there were strategic missiles on Ukrainian territory, on Kazakhstan territory, and Belarus. Those remained controversial well into the 1990s. They were ultimately resolved through various documents signed in 1994, including the Budapest Memorandum, the infamous Budapest Memorandum, but also earlier the Lisbon Protocol to Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties. So the way the Soviet Union broke up gave certain privileges to the Russian Federation that I don't think it deserved, but irrespective of what I think, they certainly allowed the Russian government to behave in a way that no other former Soviet republic can, because they don't have those ways of blocking action. If you were to try, the problem now is that it's too late in many respects to do something about that, at least within existing institutions, because the Russian Federation, through its permanent seat on the UN Security Council, is able to block any effort to take away that permanent seat. Now, potentially it could be done within the UN General Assembly. There could be an effort made, but that would require, again, there's controversy about this, is whether it could be done at all through the UN General Assembly. There have been put forth a couple of legal arguments for why it could be done, but it would require such a large majority of members of the UN General Assembly that it is very unlikely it could be achieved, because the Russian government has made an active effort to persuade countries in Africa and Latin America and in some other parts, South Asia, to take a strong stance against any change in the complexion of the UN Security Council. Now, that isn't necessarily a fatal barrier, but it's a very formidable one. Under some circumstances, you could potentially convince large regional powers like India and South Africa, Brazil, perhaps to take a stance in favor of doing away with the Russian government's stance, but it certainly isn't there now, and I see very little prospect that it will happen. So even though I don't mean to, in my presentations today, to sound unremittingly pessimistic, I have to say that if action had been taken in 1991, it would have been much better and much easier. Nowadays, it would be formidably difficult.
Thank you. So maybe we have some questions or comments from the audience. Would someone, please?
Yeah, my name is Annette Wehrberger. I'm from the Iryna University. I'm a professor for cultural studies. And I have a short question. Could you elaborate a little bit about the element of the mercenaries and the rule, the function of the mercenaries in the war, and what is it a new one, or did you notice other cases of the use of mercenaries in the wars? Thank you.
Mercenaries would be governed by, assuming that they are acting on behalf of a certain government, which they certainly are, in the case of the Wagner Group, for example, operating on behalf of the Russian Federation, that they would be governed by the same conventions that regular Russian military forces are. And that is spelled out in the additional protocols much more than it is in the 4 original Geneva Conventions. So they too could be prosecuted under those protocols and all other international legal obligations the Russian government has, for example, with regard to the Genocide Convention, with regard to other obligations. So that is not an escape route. If you had mercenaries operating on their own, as is the case in some conflicts, some civil wars, for example, in Africa have had mercenaries involved that are just there to steal resources, diamonds and other resources. They are regarded as outside international law and just regarded as terrorists or criminals. So there is no way that the use of mercenaries can escape having that threat of punishment.
Before the break, so we also can collect some 2-3 questions. So one question here.
Thank you. My name is Maria Vladimirova. I work for the Communist Party of Germany. Recently, I wrote a paper about Russian politics of international law, and what you presented today is also somehow part of this topic. So my question would be, when you look at Russian strategic papers, you see that they put forward many of international legal concepts. They actually do operate with them, but if you look how they conduct their combat operations, of course there is a huge discrepancy, but their politics still stuck to the language of international law. From your perspective, where you see the source of this discrepancy? Thank you.
It's a good question. I mean, if you look, for example, at Stalin's Soviet Union, you will see that there was an effort to create a veneer of legality on a great deal of what was being done, so that there were directives issued that authorized the use of torture, and then Stalin would sign long lists of people to be tortured. But he had preceded that by issuing directives or having the figurehead Soviet parliament adopt legislation that would provide for the use of torture, and other efforts to create a veneer of legal procedure on the mass terror that was going on. There were the show trials have their origins in that effort. The show trials of the senior communists who were purged under Stalin. There were also the Great Terror of 1937 to 38, when there were 800,000 people shot that were mostly non-communists in this case. They were shot in the space of 16 months, which is an astonishing rate of mass murder. It is equivalent to what the Khmer Rouge committed in Cambodia. No one was ever held accountable for any of that. But there was an effort made through the issuance of directives and of the adoption of certain laws to give a veneer of legality to it. So nowadays, it's not a direct throwback to that, but it is certainly influenced by that legacy of sham legality that the Soviet regime attached a lot of importance to. If you look, for example, at the way the wars in Chechnya were conducted, Russian troops were given no training in the Geneva Conventions, but they were given training in, or at least told what the directives told them to do, which were usually to not be governed by international legal obligations. So I put on the screen that under the Russian Constitution, it's supposed to be the other way around, that the international legal norms that the Russian government has committed itself to undertake are supposed to take precedence over the directives and other legal edicts that Russian troops receive. But in fact, it's the opposite, that they are given no training in the international legal norms and instead are just told or are just given instruction or compelled to follow the legal documents that the Russian Defense Ministry issues to them on the types of operations they're supposed to conduct, and no effort made to reduce any damage to civilian populations or to treat prisoners of war humanely. I hope, by the way, that that issue will come up a good deal in this conference, is the treatment of prisoners of war. It's a very, very troubling one. that is true in all wars. There's no war that I have looked at in which prisoners of war have been treated fully properly. But this war in particular is notable for some of the grotesque abuses, and many of these have made the news, but a lot of them haven't. And I hope that in any effort to set up a criminal tribunal, that there will be systematic collection of testimonies from prisoners of war who return.